Welcome to Making Games for Good. I'm Maria Burns-Ortiz. I am Executive Director of Global Game Jam, and I will tell you more about myself in a minute. But I'm going to start by assuming that you've come to this session because you're interested in making games for good, social impact games. Because it's a beginner level session, I'm also going to assume that it's something you're considering, you're early in your career in that front, but it's not something that you have a ton of experience in. Because I know there are a lot of really good sessions, I just want to say if it becomes immediately apparent as I'm talking that you say, oh my gosh, this is absolutely not for me, please, I used to create games and ask middle school children, like 11 to 14, what they thought about them, so it does not hurt my feelings, nothing I take personal. In Global Game Jam, we talk about sometimes you create a game when you do Global Game Jam, and sometimes you realize, you fail, and that's part of also learning. So, on the technical side, I have one chili pepper, so I'm going to talk about making games, but not super deep technically. And when I talk about making, it's a lot around the content side. Not things that you can do like Playing for the Planet, where you're able to build things into existing games around social impact, or tools like Dot's Echo. All of those are great ways to add social impact into existing games, but I only have 45 minutes. So one other thing I feel obligated to say is if this is your primary goal, right, social impact games at this point in time are probably not the way to go. This does not mean you're going to be out on the street with like a tin cup. It's just not Scrooge McDuck sitting on a pile of cash level of money, right? But one of the reasons why I co-founded an educational game company as a company and not as a nonprofit, well, because I wanted to prove that it was possible to do good in the world and do well financially. And the fact that that company still exists 13 years later, I think is a testament to that. Not only were we able to do millions of dollars in business, but we were able to serve hundreds of thousands of kids. And I wanted to start with that because I think we don't often enough talk about money in the social impact space. And I think if you're creating games for good, you also have to be driven as much by purpose as anything else, because there will be times where you have to decide if it's better for your bank account or your players and make that choice. That said, I can't think of any other games that are more worth making, and hopefully in the next 42 minutes or so, I will convey why. So I'm a person who likes to know what's going on. Here is the plan. Like all plans, it's subject to change a little bit, but I have a fixed deck, so I probably won't deviate too much. But I'm gonna give you an intro, talk about serious games versus casual or entertainment games, the advantages and challenges that I have seen when folks make that jump from the game industry to the serious game space. I'm gonna talk about what makes for good serious games with examples, and then where you get money for that, and then Q&A a little bit. So with a quick overview, a serious game is a game developed for a purpose other than just entertainment, right? There's a lot of ways to say that, so I might say serious game, or educational game, learning game, social impact game, games for good. Some people could argue there's tiny nuances between them, but I kind of use them interchangeably, partly just so I'm not saying the same thing over and over and over. Now this is a look that I know well. It's a look that people in entertainment games tend to give you when you say, I make educational games. Not you guys, because you're obviously here. But I would go to GDC or E3 and people say, oh, what kind of games do you make? And I'd say, oh, we make learning games. They go, oh, that's nice. But here's what the games we made did, right? Our first game was a game to teach math for indigenous kids in rural communities that were in many cases below grade level. In 10 weeks, kids who played our games improved math score 30% over the kids that didn't, right? Kids learned how to multiply. Kids who did not like math were asking their teachers to play a game that challenged them in that subject. We created a game that was used as a supplemental tool for kids who were, instead of having to write in paper journals, for kids who were for youth ages 13 to 19 who were in treatment for substance abuse. Right? We created a game with a tribe whose language was declared extinct. So that means the first language speaker of that language had passed away, and they wanted to build a game to try to revitalize their language, using a digital tool to quite literally be part of that effort to bring their game back to life. So through the games that I've been part of making, we have had the ability to impact hundreds of thousands of players, providing them skills and knowledge that will directly benefit their life. To me, that is amazing, right? That is the transformative power of making games for good. So I started my career creating games that integrated math and tribal history. We built a game with one community, and in the US, there are 574 indigenous nations. And after we built a game with one tribe, we were approached by another one to create a game using their history to teach math. And because word of mouth spreads sometimes, for better or for worse, in our case, better, we ended up working across 26 total tribes to build out games. From there, we had someone who works in addiction treatment say, you know those games that are teaching math and history, can you use them to teach other things? And we said, like what? And he said, like healthy decision making. So we tried that, and we built out 3 games around that. From there, we moved into teaching games that taught math and English, to English to Spanish-speaking youth, so they weren't falling behind because language was a barrier. Like I said, we had an indigenous language preservation organization say, now can you make those in indigenous languages? And we said, well, we can do the technology piece. And they said, yeah, well, we're an indigenous language preservation org, so we can do the tech piece, the language piece, and we moved into that. And then from there, we got the opportunity to take the work that we've been doing into Latin America and expand it into Chile. So all told, in under 12 years, we made, I think, 31 or 32 games. Our team typically ranged between 5 and 7. At one point, when we were running operations both in the US and Chile, I think we hit 11. And in that time, I've seen hundreds, maybe thousands of educational, serious type of games, met hundreds of others working in this space, and here is some of the things I found. Most serious games fall short, and this isn't just my opinion, data will prove it right? We've seen so many companies come and go, and while the company I was running still exists, I feel like I can kind of define a lot of the problems coming down to one of 2 things in games, sometimes both. They're boring, right? This is the biggest area where I think that game developers, designers, creators have an advantage. But another challenge is often they do not produce outcomes. And I think this is the biggest area where I see game developers, creators, designers struggle on that part. So boring for someone coming from the games industry is a challenge that's easier to solve, right? We go back, we add additional elements, we can make it more fun after we've built out the game. However, outcomes matter more. In a game, there's an objective, right? You know if you've achieved it. You either win, your score goes up, you get further. I rarely operate in absolutes, but this is a hill I will die on. Serious games need to have a measurable objective, right? If you can't quantify it, if you can't measure it, how do you know that you've achieved it? This is something I occasionally get pushback on, but I will say I've only ever gotten pushback on this from people who are coming from the game side. No one ever from healthcare or education or disinformation or financial literacy ever says, well, who cares if we've measured that, right? And so I think this is really important to say. And we need to care, because I used to go into schools and say, replace some of your math class time with the games that we've created. And if those games do not produce outcomes, it's not just like the game didn't work. We have taken time away from kids who are already behind and failed them further, right? And that was something that I couldn't do. So they had better work. Now, the approach to date has too often been this chocolate-covered broccoli approach, right? That the non-pure entertainment aspect is bad, right? And in essence, in the process of making that less attractive part more attractive, we make it even worse, because I've never met anyone who's like, chocolate-covered broccoli, that sounds delicious, right? But I think that's kind of what we've seen happen in games for social impact, right? we often talk about, serious games, educational games, and I will say we talk about they're like the ugly stepsisters, right? Like, the lesser game when you compare them to the pure entertainment game. But I am here to argue they are not the ugly stepsister, but the ugly duckling, right? They are misunderstood in comparison, made to feel like they're not that great. And then when they find out where they actually belong, they realize that no, they're perfectly right. Now I'm gonna ask you, think about the best, most beautiful, greatest game you can think of, right? There's likely not a serious game on the market that can come up with whatever any of you just thought. It cannot compete right now, what we have out there. But can I create something more engaging than this? 1,000,000%, right? My game doesn't need to be better than World of Warcraft or GTA, which is good because they have like $1 bajillion, and I did not, right? They just need to be better than what is currently being used. So if it's worksheets, PDFs, online click-throughs, literally nothing, right? That's what you have to compete with. And I think it's an easier challenge in some ways, but it's the hardest part for folks that I find when they come from social impact games to traditional video games. I'm going to show you really quick what that means and what that looks like. So the first game I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you 2 examples. Made both of them. The first game took us probably, 9 months to complete. It was about 2 hours of gameplay, cost a couple $100,000, right? And so as a game, it was, like I said, working with indigenous communities. We had a part where you had to figure out if your tribe was going to move, and you needed to know, was fishing getting worse or better? So you're going through, you're canoeing down the river to get to the fishing spot, right? This is me. I had to do the screen capture, so it's a little slower for me. I'm not as good as the kids that played it. You go to the fishing spot, you start to calculate whether you need more fish, you get it, you get to then go on and go fishing, right? Then you have to figure out how many deer you need. You go through and you get that, and you're just great, right? So this next game took us maybe 9 weeks, right? We built it out, again, working with a different tribe. And there's a menu, kids go to, they pick it, they pick what kind of problems they want to do, they get it right, they get to go get buffalo, right? And they're hunting buffalo. You're saving your village from an epidemic. You go, you get berries, you try and find something that you lost, right? You go through this. You figure out how people survived in the winter when it was really cold. You go through a game. You die, you learn about afterlife, right? So you've gone through this, you get points, and you get to cash them in a store kind of setting, right? And this game, like I said, if you asked me 7 years ago, or if you asked anyone working in games, investors, things like that, which is the better game, and almost everyone would say, well, the first game, right? Because it's 3D, it's more immersive, it looks cooler. But when we looked at what was more successful, it was the second game by far. We had probably 3 times as many users in 2 months of the other game that we had on the market for over a year, right? It ended up a series. We had people coming to us saying, can you make a game like that for us? And it total cost us maybe $30,000, and it made us a lot more money, right? I will argue that it's about shifting your perspective, right? Not looking at it the lens here of the beautiful young girl, if that's what you're seeing, right? But looking at it, maybe it's the wise old man, right? It's not wrong, it's just different. And so here's another example of what I mean. This is a game, it's a horror game called One Leaves. It was an Xbox game. You go through this really creepy high school setting. And then you get to the end. Let's see, it's kind of dark here, and you either get out or you find out that this has been a game about not smoking, and it's called One Leaves because actually of every 4 kids that start smoking, only 1 ever quits, right? And if you look at this through the lens of a pure console type of game, it will probably get the reception, I think it had like 5 out of 10, right? Because it's kind of lukewarm reception. But if you look at it, the lens for, this was a PSA that came out that was like in magazines at the exact same time, right? same exact concept, but which do you think is going to be more effective for that teaching part, right? This image or a game, right? And I think, again, it comes down to the lens that you are viewing it from when you go through that. Now, I talked before why most serious games have fallen short in areas where I've seen game developers struggle, and I wanted to dig a little bit more into that. So, both looking at where game industry folks really have some room to grow and where they have an edge. So this first is the most obvious, right? Game industry people have the technical and design skills to make good games compared to people that don't, right? Seems obvious. Not only are we, I'd like to say, good at making games, but good at coming up with them, right? We actually went and toured a country estate on Friday, and every time I do something like that, I'm learning about a subject, like my mind goes directly to, how could I make this a game when someone's touring or talking about something, right? And I immediately started thinking about it. We saw this room, and I was like, that is just like the scene from Murder in the Alps, right? Where it's like a search and find, and you can learn about it, and you click on things. And I think a lot of times I see non-games folks struggle with, like, how do you make this interesting? How do you make this a game, right? Games at their core are also about creating engaging experiences, right? And the point is when you're creating a game is what is something that a person is going to want to continue to engage with, and that is so powerful when we think about education. And I use Tetris as an example, both of, obviously a game that's really engaging, but also in her book, Reality is Broken. You should definitely read this if you're interested in educational games or serious games at all, from Jane McGonigal. She talks about, Tetris being an infinite game, so that it's just harder and harder until you lose, right? And yet we keep playing it. And this is fundamental, because I came across this graphic maybe a decade ago about what makes good video games, and I would argue it's the exact same thing that makes good learning, right? But in a game, you have effort, you try, you fail, you pick something up, you learn, you try again, and you try again, you go through that cycle until you succeed. But when you think about the learning experience, what is the absolute worst thing that could happen, right? You fail. Like, that's what we do not teach people in school that you want. You shouldn't fail. It's negative. And yet when I will talk to folks and I'll say, well, imagine this. And I use Super Mario because no matter who you are talking to, everybody knows that game even if they don't like it. So what if the game was Mario just ran and then saved the princess and that was it? And that would be an awful game, right? No one's like, that sounds like it's so much fun. And yet, in education, that's kind of the way that we approach it, right? That there's not these ups and downs. And so I think when we look at it through that lens, games become such a powerful tool for teaching people, whatever that is. Like I said, whether it's a traditional classroom setting or it's anything else. So I've told you all the ways that you are great and hopefully build out your confidence, but before you run out and say, I'm from the games industry, I can do this better than anyone, there's just a few teeny tiny things that I think you might want to try and push yourself on if you're thinking about that. And the first is this mindset, I touched a little bit on it, about moving past what is the coolest, most cutting edge thing to what is practical, right? If you compare these two mazes, and I made both of them, they literally do the same thing, right? You're going through a maze, you're collecting objects in both games, you're trying to avoid other objects in games, and so both of them, when we actually look at the engagement data, we saw no difference. When we talked to kids and got feedback, no one mentioned that, right? They said, oh, this one was higher end, it didn't matter, right? And so then when I'm building out the game, the first thing I'm thinking is like, which one's gonna cost me more, right? So good educational games, I would also say one of the things, they tend to be shorter, and I feel like when people are creating games, they're thinking more in scope. But with serious games, if you're looking at measuring outcomes, it's a lot easier to measure outcomes within a game if you don't have too many. Another thing about that is you want to give your players this sense of accomplishment that they get when they finish the whole thing, right? And so it's also, like I said, cheaper to make shorter games. However, one thing is you make a shorter game and then you can turn around and more quickly make the next game. So it doesn't mean that you can't have a sequence. It doesn't mean that you can't build out a series. It's just do it in pieces, right? And you may not be able to do some of the things. I have been to some amazing talks this week from Warner Brothers and CCP around art, right? And they were showing things, and I'm not gonna lie, they were visually superior, right? But based on budgets, that's like comparing apples to vacuum cleaners, right? And I would say, just because you can't do the coolest, most cutting edge things doesn't mean you can't do something cool, right? Would I like to have a Ferrari? Sure, but in my budget, I drive a Volvo, right? And I think that gets you around just fine. Coming back again to money again, and I do this because I think it comes up, and like I said, I think people don't often think about that part. I would say it does save you money by taking that approach, right? And my perspective is it is better to have create a game with the money that you have than ending up running out of money and having an unfinished game. And you might say, is that? So there was a game, I'm gonna say it was 2017, and it was beautiful. It came out and it had been $7 million had been put into it. And I just thought, this is incredible. It was like this virtual world, and the graphics were perfect, and everything was phenomenal. And they put out, like I said, it wasn't even a full level, it was like a demo level. And then I was like, I can't wait to see what happens. And then a couple years went by, and never heard about it again. And I asked someone later, and I said, what ever happened to that? And she said, I know, because I was working on it. And what had happened was they burned all $7 million on that one demo level. The guy, last I heard, ended up leaving the country, right? And nothing ever happened. So it could have been really cool, but in that span, I'd made probably 10 games and was able to continue to build it up. Not everything is fun. If you have children, you've probably said this. But sometimes learning is hard or boring. And that doesn't mean that you don't need to know it. In that case, the goal then becomes to understand why what you're being taught matters and how it will be applied. And so maybe it might still be kind of boring, but at least you see the value and you understand how you're going to use that. We did a lot of research on gameplay and education. My co-founder has a PhD in educational psychology, and so we found that really like two-minute model was good, right? The folks on the game side, if it was more than 2 minutes of content, of instruction, whatever that was, they felt like then it just became kind of boring. And the folks on the content side, the outcomes measure side, felt if it was too much gameplay, then was it accomplishing that goal, right? And we always say, in a negotiation, the goal is that kind of both people are not thrilled, right? And so, or they kind of reluctantly agree. And so that's what we kind of found, is to use it and break it up. And then we would also use gameplay sometimes as a reward. So you got this part done, you accomplished that objective, whatever the learning goal was, the outcome goal, now you get to play a game, right? And so there's that incentivizing it. And we use them as, like I said, as a reward. When you're talking, we talk about compliment sandwiches sometimes. Like you say something nice, and then you say something that maybe people don't want to hear, and you say something nice, and then the idea is that they kind of pull that together. And so we kind of use games as a version of that, right, to get the players through. There is also a perception challenge, right? This idea that games are not valuable tools. And I think bad social impact games have played into that, because they'll say, well, we tried this and it didn't work, right? And the answer is maybe they weren't really built out around that. And people will tell me, oh, I think it's a generational perception, and I think sometimes that's true, that, an older generation maybe is always just sees games that way. It has this inability to differentiate between serious and educational games or entertainment games. But I've actually heard it from a lot of folks who just make games, because they're like, oh, well, I wouldn't, see that as a valuable tool for learning, because they haven't really thought that part through, or they haven't, again, seen examples. The solution to that, actually, I was pitching to a government level official who said to me, I like everything that you're saying, but we as an agency don't like the word games. And I said, well, what? And they said, so can you call it interactive digital media? And I said, if you give me a check, I will call it whatever you want, right? It was not about changing the project scope. It was not about anything. It was just about, there are people that are going to give pushback on that, and can we change that? And I will also talk in a little bit, when I show some of the examples, about ways that you can take a lot of things that we do in games, game elements, and put them into things, and maybe they're not full games, but that you can apply those. But yeah, and then when I say interactive digital media, people go, oh, that sounds very serious. Yes, we're very much on board. Now, I said earlier that far too many social impact games, especially those developed by folks you with a purely game background, who think they'll make a really good, serious game, fall short. And I am a big believer of this, and of having those measurable outcomes. And I think we were fortunate in some ways because both myself and my co-founder came from backgrounds where we'd been in classrooms and taught. But so always really putting that impact objective first in the project, and everything we did in the design, especially we were saying, well, where are we in advancing to make sure that we're getting those outcomes and that folks are learning about them, and putting that first. But as I tell people when they try to debate me about if it's really important, one, it's my opinion, yes, I will not be swayed. But I say that in serious games, the word serious comes first for a reason, right? And full disclosure, I know this doesn't work in every language. Like I speak Spanish, it doesn't work there. I'm not sure how the structure works in Polish with adjectives, but fortunately, this topic is in English. So, I will say that again, and I like I say, I repeat this, folks. Serious games, so you have to have the serious part. Otherwise, it's just a game. And I don't think it's that hard to prioritize. It just comes down a bit to a mindset shift. And I think it's an easier way to look at it if we visualize outcomes as fundamental to the game as we do game data. Because if you said to someone, if someone says to you, what is your retention rate? What is your churn rate? What is your session length or your player count? You would think that is, no one says, no idea. Or, do we really need to track that? But, when it comes to educational games, I think, when it comes to social impact games, again, if you're not measuring the social impact, how do you know that you're making an impact? I'm often asked for what kinds of games make for good game topics, and so I like to I used to teach virtual game design during the pandemic to middle schoolers, and they would talk about, we need examples. So here are some examples of spaces where I've seen games be successful, and just also some general observations. So education is obviously the first and foremost. When I said one of the things I see is people trying to hide the teaching, and like I said, chocolate-covered broccoli does not work, right? So learning isn't something that needs to be hidden, and in fact, there's a lot of data that shows people love learning, right? But it's about learning and understanding why that matters and how it's applicable, which is great because games provide an opportunity to do that. So, I always do say this, I ran an educational video game company for 12 years, and no one ever ran into my office and said, hey, quick, what's 5 times 7, right? But when you're learning, that's kind of how it's presented often, right? These ideas of drills. And so we would look at things like, if you have 42 people in your village and each deer feeds 6 people, how many deer do you need to go out and get, right? It is this idea of applying real world skills in a virtual world. And we learn better when we're engaged, and we're engaged when we feel is real world applicable. And far too often, educational, social impact, learning games do not reflect the vast reality for so many people. When we did a game in Chile, the first thing that we heard from every kid was, and even the teachers, adults, anyone showed, was the Spanish. It's Chilean Spanish, right? They were so used to not getting content that reflected them. It might be in their language, but it didn't reflect their reality. Or we did games for kids in rural communities, and they said everything is always about cities, right? And if you live in a town of 5,000 people, something about, a million people just doesn't make sense, right? And so we wanted to take away, look at, those were creating barriers when there was so much, and there's now, really technology has lowered those barriers, and there is so much untapped potential. And when I look across different global markets, that is a huge thing that I see, is this ability to now be able to create learning games in languages that are culturally reflective. And it's not just about the players, right? There's things you can do like aligning to national education standards or different national initiatives, right? That hasn't happened yet. So to reach kids, you need to meet them on the technology where they are, or to reach any players, right? I think especially if we're talking about games as a way to get outreach, mobile and web are really the ways to go. Sometimes PC, and I say that with a very reluctant sometimes, but it's not consoles or VR, right? And here's how I know why. I've never heard a teacher say yes, but we would definitely use that. But my sister teaches at a school in Los Angeles, and this is, I've never had a teacher, when I've told this story, it said, oh, well, my school, it's different. And when everyone was talking about the VR revolution, right, which at some point may come for education, but, I said to her, they're talking about that. What do you think about that? And she said, I work at a school where I am limited in the amount of paper that I'm allowed to use. Do you think these people are going to buy me an Oculus for every kid in my class, right? And it's exactly the case, right? In, I want to say 2018 or 2019, Assassin's Creed was really pushing this discovery mode where you could play through the game and just go through all of the educational part, right? And there was no dying or killing or anything. But they were going to some of these ed tech conferences, and folks said, well, but it has to play on a console, right? And they'd say, well, yeah, but you only need one Xbox for a classroom. And a lot of the folks in the space were saying, it's not going to happen. And they pushed back, and then suddenly, the pandemic happened, but suddenly it never was ever mentioned again, because I think, again, it was, where are they going to be able to get in front of these users? And it was not in the classrooms that they had. By contrast, I once went into a computer store and I said, give me the worst computer that you have. And they all said to me, do you mean the cheapest? And I said, no, the worst. And every single person, because they kind of gathered around this point, they're like, that one, right? So I was like, thank you, this is a computer I will take. But the point is, if it runs on that, I know it will run on anything, right? And when that was my goal, is how do we make sure that what we're creating reaches the players that we're trying to reach? Health is another sector where I've seen a lot of games funded, and it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you think about it, it's another area where there's often a lot to learn. The information is often kind of dry or complex, and games provide a way to learn more about that, right? To break that down completely. So from what you might find in medical literature. So this game is called My Diabetic. I believe it's Czech. And it shows, about healthy food and how you use an insulin pen. And then there's mini games explaining it, right? And so the question is, if you think about it, going back to you only have to be better than the status quo, which seems like something that's much more engaging, that people would want to use, right? You have this game, or you have a pamphlet or a flyer, whatever it is that they give you, right? Another way that games, especially in healthcare, and are really great is using simulations, right? So it allows you to experience scenarios in a virtual world without dealing with those real world consequences. So this game, Glucosaur, is French, and it's based, again, another one teaching about diabetes, but in this case, it's about, your blood sugar goes up or down, and if it gets too high or too low, you can experience those things without having to actually have the negative impact, right, in real life. And then you also can realize why you should be mindful of that, because you don't want that to happen to you. In the internet age, especially with social media, there is mediums that are being used to spread false information. So whether it's intentional or just incorrect, this is a major concern. And fortunately, tools as a digital medium can help solve this problem in the digital space. Agents of Influence is a game I like to cite because it helps teach kids media literacy, right? How do you analyze information? You use this game to analyze information and determine if it's accurate or unreliable, because I always like to tell kids, fun fact, not everything on the internet is true. And then inoculation theory is another one that's used for games. This is a game called Cat Park, which was an initiative from the State Department with a bunch of things. And basically, inoculation theory is this idea that suggests that when you expose people to arguments, they will be less likely to be persuaded by them in the future, right? They'll be more aware of what those arguments look like. And so this game is actually largely, what I said, it's a game, but I would also say it fits under that interactive digital media category, right? Where you go through the story and you make different decisions, so you're exposed to that. Culture is a big one, and it's a bit tied to culturally reflective content, but we talked about in education, but a bit broader. So language preservation, like I said, we did a number of games in indigenous languages or languages that are on the verge of disappearing. And there are a lot of those languages, right? Of over 7,000 languages, 43%, so more than 3,000 of them, are classified as endangered. So there's about 90 million people who speak languages that are on the verge of extinction. And And we know games can teach languages, but when I got into this, what I started realizing was we weren't just creating games to teach them, we were in many ways creating digital archives of languages that may no longer exist, right? That could be used for that. Preservation, so in 2021, Global Game Jam hosted a cultural heritage game jam. And the winning game, Purumachu, was a game created by Peruvian and Swedish developers, focused on this idea of teaching folks about cultural preservation of relics and history and the importance of that, right? Tourism. So I was talking to someone yesterday in the business lounge from Georgia, and we were talking about serious games and the uses of them. And their game, Odyssey, was nominated for one of the awards. And I mentioned that one of the cases that I was going to be talking about was using games and tourism, right? Because some countries are using them as tools. How do you get people to know about where you are? How do you get people to know about your city or your country or whatever that is? And it turned out that their game was actually funded by their local tourism agency within the government, right? And so it's a way to, how do you get people excited about places that maybe they wouldn't have heard about, and games. Along that same vein, and I guess it's kind of dark here, but both tourism and preservation, so technology can be used to create experiences to take you to places, game technology that you could not go otherwise, right? That might be inaccessible to the public, or just, whether that means too far away or it's, not accessible anymore, preserving places that may no longer exist in the future. The folks at Stargate Studios in Malta are doing really cool things with Unreal and LiDAR, so I would recommend checking that out. And then technology from games, like I said, when I was talking about interactive digital media, can be used to create digital experiences with regard to culture. So I've seen a number of projects like this. This is a Cahokia Mounds in the US. It was an ancient community. We didn't do this game, but it was an indigenous community. And these folks worked with the preservation site to create an experience when people are there so that they're able to then look at the site and see with AR technology what it looked like. This same app has kind of an experience where you can go through, I'm 99% sure it was probably built in Unity, where you go in and you virtually explore what a dwelling that looked like before. So that's just a small fraction of what serious games can do, and there's certainly many, many other uses, seeing everything from climate change to financial literacy. And like I said, I hate when people say it could be used for anything, but it really can be in a lot of ways, although I like to show the ways that it's commonly being used, because that means that's where people are putting money and effort into it, right? And so that's a great option. Now, the big question always becomes, who is going to pay for it? And I know you're probably thinking that to yourself, this sounds great, but this is actually what it looks like when you're making games, right? Any kind of game, I think. And especially when you talk about, I want to make social impact games, everyone says, that is so important, it's so necessary, everybody needs that, I really support that. And then when you say that to people about funding and what their thoughts are on that, they kind of give you this, and I gotta, see a man about a thing, and they're out. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that serious games is as big a market as entertainment games, but right now it's about 12 to 15 billion US dollars, but it's growing at a tremendous rate, right? It's double kind of the entertainment market. Like I said, those games also cost less to make, and the interesting thing is I was talking to folks yesterday, and it kind of dawned on me that the longevity of those games is longer, right? They're talking about how long you expect a title to go, and this game has been around for 10 years, and that's really incredible. With serious games, I'd say one of the things we did was education. It was like, every year I had a new built-in audience. I was hoping not to retain my third graders that were using our game, but the next year there was a whole new crop of third graders, and that went on and on. So we have games that have been on the market for 12 years, and every year we have new built-in folks, right? There's always, and it sounds, I don't want to say it sounds bad, there's always people being diagnosed with, a disease or things like that. There's always a need for that, and you can use these games to continue that. You're less likely to have a major hit, but I have found often, and especially in talking with folks with educational games, it becomes more of a reliable, steady thing, right? It's not just dependent on this is going to have to make it. It's like, okay, this game, that one, and you build out that pipeline. And like I said, much of the global market is untapped. I hope that we will see a huge shift in starting to that as this perception starts to change and technology has made that easier. But there are people giving out money, and giving out, I don't mean like just throwing bags of money at you, but places that you can go to get them. And so these are, I would say, because everyone's such a diverse audience, and I can't say specifically, this is where you should go, but kinds of types of revenue streams and funding to look at. So the first one being grants, right? We funded a lot of our initial development with grants, and they can come from, we got them from governments, we got them from NGOs, we got them from companies. Lots of different people give out grants to make, especially games, like I said, or interactive digital media, right? The best part about that, my favorite word, is it is non-dilutive capital, which means you don't have to give up anything to anyone. It's just money. Here you go. The applications that are long can take a long time to write, right? And we kind of looked at it as like, am I going to go pitch it and get a low hit rate, or am I going to take that time, put into a grant where I have a higher hit rate, right? Shorter applications I actually loathe, because I feel like so often like that it's just like they get 1 million of them and you're basically buying a lottery ticket, but sometimes it pays off, right? But there are often restrictions on how you can use that money. You can't say, oh, I've changed my mind and I want to do a different project. No, you've said you're going to do this. You're going to do this. Customized development is a way to do it. I said we did a number of projects with people, for people, either way. And again, governments, NGOs, companies, I've seen an uptick in museums who are like, we have this activity, we want to do it. It's great because it's direct revenue, right? So you've got money up front. It's also non-dilutive and it is recurring. So usually, if you do a really good game with someone, they will come back the next time they want to do it, the next time. Word of mouth is great. The issue is all of the revenue is up front, right? So it's not like I'm going to make this game, then I'm going to make a ton on the back, but you make that game, you get the revenue, and then you have money to make the next, and then you go make the next game. And the thing is, some people get frustrated because it's not just your vision, you have to work with them. I've had folks that I've worked with have said, do not care, let me know the final product, trust you, and I've had folks that have been very much like, we want to be very involved. Either way, it's depends on if you have a strong preference. Impact investors, right? So there are angels and social impact investors. My favorite part about that, so we did a lot of grants, we did angels, we did VC round with very specific impact-driven VCs. My favorite part on that is there's no restrictions on the money, and having done grants where it was like, you have to do it for this, and to have someone say, here's some money, you can use it for whatever you want, was great. It's a different type of investors, right? So a lot of times investors like, I want to get a 10x return, or I want a rev share, I want all these things. Impact investors, double bottom line, are not looking, they still need a return, right? Otherwise they're just donors. But they're not necessarily looking for that 10x. They're looking for something more reasonable, 3, 4 is fine by them. You are giving up equity. And like I said, it's a different type of investor. So some things are pro, some things are con. You do need to typically publish and sell your own game. There's not the traditional publisher where you go and sell an educational or a serious game or an impact game to a publisher, and then they take care of some of those things. So you're also building out a business and publishing side with that. But there are some, and there's always this ongoing list of publishing platforms. So once you've made your game, these are platforms that you can put it on, and they will monetize it for you. Legends of Learning is by far, I would say, the biggest. Games Learning is a new one. There's always new ones coming up, and I hear from different countries. But the thing about that is you put your game up and you generate revenue, and they send you a check, usually quarterly. It's non-exclusive in that they don't usually say you can be with their competitor, but you can be with, you can sell it on your own, you can put it through your own site, the app stores, whatever you want. Just like with anything, visibility can be tough there, right? So it's how do you rise above the noise, which is what you're gonna face, whatever kind of game you're making. And the check sizes can be small, but again, like I said, if you're making a bunch of games over time, small checks add up and you're getting a relatively decent size of revenue quarter over quarter. So I've talked about social impact games. Like I said, I'm executive director of Global Game Jam. So if you're interested, saying, yes, I'm really interested in creating social impact games, we are actually running a game jam in the not too distant future. We did a United with Ukraine game jam in 2022 in Warsaw with around creating cultural heritage games. And we are actually rolling out a game jam in just a couple of weeks that will be about creating games to increase awareness of and skepticism around disinformation. As I talked about, that's a big thing. The registration isn't open yet, but I did create a little GIC form so when it is, folks can be part of that, and really creating ways that you can, if you're interested in social impact games, take a chance on it.